Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive into the Civil War with us today? We're going deep, using the American Yawp as our guide. And, we really want to understand, what actually caused this whole thing, the big turning points, and how it still shapes America today, all without getting, lost in the weeds.
Yeah, it's a lot, but grasping those core issues is like the key to really understanding the war and, its consequences.
Right, so let's start with, well, how it all began. The election of 1860. That was not exactly smooth sailing, was it?
No, no, not at all. I mean, you had four candidates running for president,
Hmm.
and each one represented these deeply divided factions, even within their own parties. The Democratic Party, the oldest one in the country, they literally fractured over slavery. Imagine that. Southern Democrats just walked out of their own convention because they couldn't get a pro-slavery platform.
Wow. So Lincoln wins, but it wasn't some huge victory or anything.
Not even close. He got less than 40% of the popular vote. It was
Huh.
so split between all four of them that even with that small percentage, he got the electoral votes.
And I bet that just made the South even more anxious. They saw Lincoln as like a threat to their whole way of life.
Oh, absolutely. And their fears weren't totally unfounded either.
Yeah.
The Mississippi Secession Declaration, it straight up says that they seceded to protect slavery. They even said, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world.
Wow, that's pretty direct. It shows just how central slavery was to their identity and how scared they were of what Lincoln might do.
Exactly. It wasn't just politics. It was their economy, their way of life, like their whole sense of who they were.
So they secede, the Confederacy's formed, and now the nation's on the edge of war. What was the Union's plan at the start?
At first, it was all about the Anaconda Plan. They wanted to slowly cut off the Confederacy, using blockades to shut down their ports and waterways, basically cripple their economy and their ability to, even fight.
Still, strangle them economically while ground troops moved in. Seems like a pretty smart, though maybe slow, plan.
Yeah, it was definitely a war of attrition designed to wear them down.
But there were also those border states to consider. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, stuck right in the middle.
Their loyalty was crucial. Lincoln knew keeping them with the Union was vital, especially Maryland, being right next to Washington, D.C. He even went so far as to suspend habeas corpus there.
Now, for those who don't know, habeas corpus is basically the right to challenge your detention, in court. So Lincoln suspends this, allowing arrests of pro-secession people without charges. That was risky, wasn't it?
It was a calculated risk for sure,
Yeah.
but strategically essential
Mm.
to secure such a, vital area. And then there were the escaped slaves. They really forced the Union to finally deal with slavery head on.
It's like they shined a spotlight on the issue, made it impossible to ignore.
Exactly. At first, the Union was hesitant. But as thousands escaped to Union lines seeking freedom, it became, well, morally and politically impossible to just turn away.
And then you've got General Butler at Fort Monroe. Instead of sending escaped slaves back, he calls them contraband of war, like their horses or cannons. What was he thinking?
Butler was a clever guy, this move, which Congress later backed up,
Yeah.
created this legal gray area for escaped slaves. It wasn't full citizenship, but it was a huge step towards not sending them back to enslavers.
So not perfect, but a turning point for sure in how the Union dealt with slavery.
Definitely the focus shifted from just preserving the Union to starting to include this idea of emancipation.
Then comes the Battle of Antietam in 62. That was a huge turning point in the war itself.
Oh, absolutely. Antietam was a bloodbath. It was the bloodiest single day in American history, but for Lincoln. It was the victory he needed. 5 days later, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
Which, importantly, didn't free every slave, just the ones in Confederate territory.
Right, it was strategic, framing emancipation as a war measure, targeting the South's labor and hoping to crush their economy and morale. It also made it much harder for Europe to support the Confederacy.
Bold move, politically and strategically, and it allowed black soldiers to finally join the Union Army officially.
Exactly. With the Emancipation Proclamation in place, the United States colored troops were formed. Over 180,000 black men, many formerly enslaved, fought for the Union, changing the character of the war forever.
What must that have been like for them, fighting for their own freedom in a nation still so divided over their equality?
Their courage was incredible. There's this famous story about a black soldier who sees his former enslaver as a prisoner of war and says, "Hello, massa, bottom rail on top this time." That one statement sums up the huge upheaval of the war. Their world was turning upside down.
And the war itself was changing too. New technologies popping up like ironclad warships, changed naval warfare forever.
The fight between the Monitor and the Merrimack and Hampton Roads, that was a pivotal moment. It was like a preview of the future of naval combat, the end of the wooden ship era.
So by 63, the war was in full swing. What was daily life like for the soldiers? I can't imagine it was pleasant.
Oh, it was far from it. Imagine the boredom of camp life, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. They endured unimaginable hardship, coped through letters, music, even trading with the enemy sometimes.
It's interesting how popular songs reflected the changing moods. Early on, all patriotic anthems and confidence, but as it dragged on, the music got more somber, reflecting the reality of it all.
Music was a lifeline for those soldiers, a way to connect with home and process the unimaginable. And it wasn't just music. They formed debate societies, played sports. They desperately tried to hold on to some normalcy in this upside-down world.
All while facing disease and injury. Civil War medicine was horrifying, wasn't it?
Disease was the biggest killer by far. More than half of all casualties were from disease. Typhus, dysentery, measles, smallpox ravaged the camps, and medical care was, well, limited.
Amputations were super common too, right? There's that image of them being done without anesthesia, just awful to think about.
That's not entirely accurate, actually. Anesthesia using chloroform or opium was pretty common for amputations. Still, it was a brutal procedure, and they didn't understand germs back then, so infection was a huge risk.
So many lives lost, families changed forever, and the impact wasn't just on the battlefields. The home front was hit hard too.
Absolutely. Women were essential to the war effort on both sides. They stepped up, ran farms and businesses, organized sanitary fairs to support the troops. Some even became spies.
Some incredible stories there. Rose O'Neal Greenhow, the Confederate spy in D.C., Elizabeth Van Lew for the Union in Richmond, they risked everything.
And for so many women, the war brought just unimaginable loss. Over 200,000 became widows, forced to navigate a new world, grief, financial hardship, societal expectations that often held them back.
It's heartbreaking to think about the toll, not just the deaths, but the rippling effects on families and communities, the draft riots, the anti-war sentiment, the constant fear. The war tested the very fabric of the nation.
Tested it in ways, yeah, few could have imagined.
But even with all that hardship, there were these amazing acts of resilience, like real innovation, too.
Oh, for sure. Take the sanitary fairs, for example. They weren't just about raising money for medical supplies.
They were huge events, weren't they?
Huge. And they became these incredible examples of community organizing, often led by women, really challenged what people thought women could do.
And we can't forget figures like Dorothy Dix, she was superintendent of Army nurses, really made a difference in improving hospital conditions in the North.
And let's not forget all those volunteer nurses, both North and South, working tirelessly in just awful conditions to care for the wounded.
It's easy to kind of forget the reality of those situations.
It is. Kate Cumming, a Confederate nurse, wrote about her experiences. Her words, they give you a real glimpse into the suffering she saw.
Do you have an example?
She wrote, "I can never again shut out of view the sights that I saw there of human misery." It reminds us that amidst the big story of the war, there were real people facing just unimaginable things.
So the war goes on, and by 1864, there's this shift in strategy, right?
Yeah, this idea of hard war emerges. The Union, under Grant, gets more aggressive, targeting civilian infrastructure, resources, that kind of thing.
So the goal was to break the South's will to fight, even if it meant hurting civilians more.
It was brutal, no doubt controversial, but it worked. Sherman's March to the Sea in late '64 is a perfect example.
Yeah, his army just cut a path of destruction through Georgia. I remember learning about that, destroying crops, railroads, anything that could help the Confederacy.
The psychological impact was huge, showed just how determined the Union was, willing to do whatever it took to win.
And Sherman captured Savannah right before Christmas, presented it to Lincoln as a gift.
Exactly. The timing was key, boosted Union morale, and crushed the Confederacy's hopes of getting help from other countries.
But even as the fighting escalated, the political side kept going. Lincoln had to run for re-election in '64. Can you imagine that? Running for president in the middle of a civil war?
It was a close one. He was up against McClellan, his former commander. McClellan wanted to end the war, negotiate peace with the Confederacy.
So basically give up on unifying the country and maybe let slavery continue.
Essentially, yeah. It showed how divided the North was over how to fight the war.
But Lincoln wins a second term. Says a lot about his leadership, the nation's desire to see it through to the end.
His win was partly due to Union victories, like capturing Atlanta. But it also showed people didn't want to just give up.
And then, just a month before the war ends, Lincoln gives his second inaugural address. It's considered one of the greatest speeches ever.
It's amazing. So short, but so powerful. This message of healing, reconciliation. In just 700 words, he calls for malice toward none and charity for all, urging the nation to bind up the nation's wounds.
Those words are still so relevant today. Shows Lincoln's vision, his understanding of the huge task of rebuilding a broken nation.
It was a call for unity, forgiveness, at a time when those things must have seemed impossible.
And then finally, it's over. Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox in April 1865. What a moment that must have been.
Marked the end of major Confederate fighting, though some smaller stuff went on for a bit. It answered the question of secession and signaled the beginning of the end for slavery.
But the war ending brought new challenges. How do you rebuild physically and emotionally after something so devastating?
Those questions would define Reconstruction. How to integrate former slaves into a society still dealing with racism, deep divisions, how to heal from the war, forge a new path forward.
And how to deal with the immense loss, the trauma inflicted on everyone.
Exactly. The Civil War wasn't just a moment in time. It was a seismic event, reshaped American history.
It ended slavery, yes, but it also left so much unfinished. Profound questions about justice, equality, what freedom really means. Yeah, it's like we're still struggling with the same questions today. What does it actually mean to be free? How do we make a society that actually lives up to those ideals, equality, justice, all that?
They do resonate, and it really highlights how the Civil War, it's not just something in the history books. It's part of us, part of the nation.
Right. It's in our laws, institutions, the stories we tell ourselves. And it still affects how we think about race, equality, freedom, everything.
Exactly. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. But that struggle for real racial justice, that went on long after the war was over.
So the Civil War didn't magically fix racism. It just changed the battlefield.
Exactly. The fight for civil rights, economic justice, equal opportunity, these are all ongoing, and they're rooted in the Civil War and what came after.
It reminds you that progress isn't always a straight line forward. It's messy with steps forward and steps back.
And it shows why understanding the past is so important. Not just dates and battles, but how it still affects us today.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm just struck by how complex it all is. There's just so much to learn, to think about, to really wrestle with.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. History isn't about memorizing facts. It's about engaging with the past, thinking about its complexities and using that to understand our present, our future.
So what parts of the Civil War's legacy do you think are still with us today?
Oh, wow. Well, we're still dealing with the effects of slavery, the impact it had on racial inequality in America, that's for sure. We're still debating the role of government, individual liberty, all those core issues. And I think we're still figuring out how to heal from that division. It runs so deep. Those are just a few. I bet our listeners could come up with a lot more.
Yeah, good point. History is a conversation, and we're all part of it.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so exciting.
Thanks for taking us through this deep dive. It's been amazing, really thought-provoking.
My pleasure. I always learn something new when we talk about this stuff.
And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has made you curious, encouraged you to learn more about this crucial time in American history. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep searching for those moments, the ones that make the past come alive.
And remember, history isn't just what happened. It's why it matters, how it shapes us, and what we can learn from it as we face the challenges of our own time.